You remember the feeling of waiting for something that never had a name, not waiting for Christmas or summer or your birthday, just waiting. A low hum underneath everything, a sense that the real version of your life was still somewhere ahead of you, loading, about to begin. You were maybe 12, maybe 14. The television was on in the other room. Someone was talking about the future like it had an address, like your generation specifically had been handed the directions. And something in your chest said, yes, that is mine. You held on to that feeling for years. And then you turned 22. And then 25, and then 30, and the future that had your name on it kept arriving slightly rearranged. The jobs were thinner than advertised. The cultural moment that everyone said belonged to you had already been claimed by the people who got there a few years ahead. The boomers had already moved in and hung their things on the walls by the time you showed up with your boxes. You stood at the door of a decade that was supposed to be yours, and it looked at you and said, "Sorry, we are full." Nobody named that feeling. Nobody wrote the song about the generation that grew up on the biggest promise of the 20th century and came of age the exact moment that promise quietly expired. But you felt it. You have always felt it. Sociologists eventually gave your generation a name. Generation Jones, born between 1954 and 1965. Sandwiched between the boomers who rewrote the world and the Gen Xers who inherited the wreckage. The generation that history keeps skipping over like a chapter it forgot to read. Jones, as in keeping up with the Joneses, as in want, as in the specific ache of a hand reaching for something absolutely promised and closing around air. Stay with me, because the psychology of what happened to you, what it did to you, what it built in you, is one of the most honest stories about a generation that nobody has bothered to tell. You are 15 years old. The world outside feels electric. Movements are happening, ideas are in the air, and the adults keep saying, your generation will finish what we started. You don't just hear that, you become it. Now, let the scene shift. You are 23. You have what you were told you needed, and you are standing at the entrance of the adult world that was described to you, and it looks nothing like the brochure. Stagflation. Interest rates that make a mortgage feel like a dare, and ahead of you, already seated, already comfortable, the generation that was just a few years older, the ones who made it before the door got heavier. You didn't get cheated out of a decade. You got something more disorienting than that. You got handed a story about yourself, a luminous, personal story, and then you watched someone else live it. Psychologists call what follows this thwarted expectation the particular damage not of being told life is hard, everyone can survive that, but of being told life will be extraordinary and discovering that extraordinary was not waiting for you. The wound was not the difficulty. The wound was the gap between what you were handed to believe and what was actually true, and you have been quietly negotiating that gap ever since. Now, I want to tell you about 3 people, 3 ways Generation Jones absorbed what happened to them. Sit with each one. Notice which one makes something in your chest go quiet. The first person built anyway. Without applause, without a myth. They looked at the gap between the promise and the reality and did something that sounds simple and is actually one of the hardest things a human being can do. They let go of the story, not bitterly, not dramatically. They said, quietly, to no one in particular, the future I was sold is not the one available, so I am going to figure out what is available and build something true inside it. They raised families in houses that cost more than was comfortable, built careers in industries the generation above had already shaped, advanced more slowly than the story implied they would, and they kept going, for decades, without a cultural identity to point to. Without a generation-wide narrative the world recognized. Research in generational psychology finds that the absence of a felt cultural story erodes something real. The sense that your life is located inside a larger meaning, that what you built matters in a way the world can see. Your generation built in the gap between 2 loud stories, and the world looked up from both of them and forgot to look at what was in between. If this is you, I want you to hear this clearly. The world not telling your story does not mean the story did not happen. It happened. every single day of it. And the fact that no one made a film about it does not reduce by one brick what you actually built. The second person held on to the light inside the dark. These are the people who never surrendered the original belief. Not the naive 15-year-old version, but something underneath it. Something the promise was pointing toward even when the promise itself turned out to be overstated. The belief that people can choose to do better, that the instinct toward justice and care that ran electric through the culture of their childhood was not just a fashion of its time, it was a signal. These are the people who spent careers in teaching, in social work, in medicine, who kept voting in elections that felt like choosing between two disappointments, who kept showing up to the meeting that 12 people attended. Psychologists call this sustained idealism. The decision to remain oriented toward hope, not because the evidence demands it, but because the alternative is to become someone unrecognizable to yourself. Cynicism is frictionless. Cynicism is just hope that got tired and sat down. These people never sat down. The third type became something history has never found the right word for. They became the people who could speak both languages. Generation Jones sits exactly, not almost, exactly, between two of the most documented generations in history. The boomers who were certain they were rewriting everything, the Gen Xers who were certain none of it could be trusted, and the people in this group learned, from that precise position between them, how to hold both things at once. They understood the boomers because they watched them from close enough to see both the idealism and the ego. They understood Gen X because they raised many of them, worked alongside them, handed things over with a directness the generation above rarely managed. When the two generations needed to be in the same room, in the workplace, in the family, in the institution, trying to change without collapsing, these were the people both sides would listen to. No one named this. No think piece celebrated it. But if you are the person who has spent a career being the one who makes different sides of a room understand each other, now you know why it came to you the way it did. You didn't learn that skill. You were built for it by the exact position you were born into. Now bring yourself back to your mid-20s. The economy is doing something nobody planned for. The cultural moment is behind you, and you are doing something that most people at that age never do. You are asking the real question. Not, what was I supposed to want? Not, what does the story say success looks like? But, what do I actually want? Underneath the noise. Underneath the promise that didn't deliver. What is actually mine? That question, asked honestly at 23, carves something permanent. It builds a kind of vision that sees through performance and mythology with a speed that still surprises the people around you. It is why, when things fall apart, you do not fall with them. It is why you recalibrate when most people haven't finished panicking. It is why the people around you, in their worst moments, instinctively look for you in the room. Here is the distinction I want to leave with you. There is disappointment, and there is what lives on the other side of it. If you walk all the way through, disappointment stays in the gap. It holds the promise in one hand and the reality in the other, and keeps measuring the distance between them. For decades, it turns the story you were given into a wound you return to, because returning is the only way to prove the wound was real. But there is something on the other side of that gap, not around it, through it, that is rarer and more valuable than the original promise ever was. Clarity, the ability to see what is actually there, to want what is actually worth wanting, to build a life that is genuinely yours rather than a smaller version of a mythology that was never really yours to begin with. Disappointment says the story they gave me was a lie, and I will never stop grieving it. Clarity says the story they gave me was wrong, and now, finally, I get to find out what is true. Your generation, at its best, walked all the way to clarity. You are not the generation that got skipped. You are the generation that found out, earlier than anyone, in harsher conditions than the story prepared you for, what was actually worth building. And what you built, quietly and without mythology, and completely on your own terms, was truer than the story they almost told you. Drop a comment and tell me, what is one thing you believed about your future when you were young that arrived completely differently than you expected? I read every single one, And if this felt like the first time someone described your generation the way it actually was, subscribe. Because the next video might explain exactly why the people who grew up between two loud stories understand the most about what it means to build something real. You were never just in between. You were the part that held everything together. The world just forgot to say so.